And so just as I already mentioned, then please allow yourself to be fully present here. So just really feel what's happening in your body. Feel your shoulders, feel your breathing, sensing what's going on in the heart, in the stomach. Don't struggle with anything. Just allow yourself to be fully here. There's nothing really to be done in this moment. You might notice the feeling of air on the skin. Notice the sensation of your clothing on the skin. And notice how each new breath has you changing shape. And there's a uniqueness to the breath. It's never the same thing twice. And as you inhale, you feel yourself expanding. So just let the body expand, trying not to control that or change the way it feels. And as you exhale, you feel your body relax. Allow the exhale to be just a little bit longer than the inhalation. And notice if there is this sense of waiting for something. This is not quite the moment. It's not quite what I want in this moment. It's not quite there. And see if you can let go of that moment and just notice this moment, what is happening in your body. Sensing the next breath. Being with that moment of where your life is happening with this breath, sensations, whatever thoughts might arise. Notice how the body is feeling. Is there anywhere that could feel more space? How about the shoulders? Or the heart? Perhaps the neck? Observe again any tendency to be anywhere else but where your body is right now. Can you sense the body here just as it is? And can you sense that just by noticing the body, you already have changed something? Something shifts. The space for change is in your awareness, not in the thinking. Bringing your awareness to the body, you allow something new to happen in the body. Just observing things arising, sensations. The quality of stiffness or tension, or quality of lightness and ease. So just take a moment now to deepen the breathing. Staying fully present to the sensations that change in the body as your breath becomes a little more animated, maybe more energizing. How the body is responding directly to the breath itself. And gradually, in your own time, bring your hands together and rub the palms. Create some heat in your hands. And very lightly cover your eyes with your palms. Just rest your fingers on top of your head for a moment. Let the eyes relax. So the eyes become soft. And when you feel ready, then open the eyes. And lower your hands. So I'd like to welcome you all to this time together. One of the things that helped me the most and that I learned most profoundly from Thich Nhat Hanh was how to manage my suffering, how to grow to understand and actually love my suffering. And this is something that I'd like to share with you today. And because there is an art to suffering, there's a way of living in this world where we can actually understand that the suffering is part of life itself and start to connect with that in a way that's not full of fear or resentment or bitterness or a sense of injustice. So we can only know what is right from what we know to be wrong. And we can only know happiness because we know unhappiness. Happiness and suffering are two sides of the same coin. We can't understand one thing in the absence of the other. So often when we feel like we shouldn't be suffering, it's actually a denial of the truth that we can only actually be happy because we understand what it means to suffer. So one way we can understand this is to recognize that we are, for example, only aware of our health when we're sick. If we're ill, we know what we want. We understand the meaning of illness because we also contrast it with health. But often when we're healthy, we don't even realize that in fact we are also sick at the same time. The two have to go hand in hand. So we can't understand health without also simultaneously understanding this illness or sickness that we might eventually have as well. And that doesn't mean we think about it. We don't dwell on it. We don't use the mind to consider it, but we just understand. We recognize that. And this is one of the great learnings of Thai. When we understand the difference between pain and suffering, we can understand the contrast between what we're doing to ourselves and what is happening in life itself. So in fact, the pain that we might experience is coming from our own experience of life itself. So there's nothing we can do about that. It's going to be inevitable. We'll fall down, we'll get hurt. There's an inevitable emotional pain or an emotional struggle in life. And equally, when we start to deal with that, what we call the first arrow, what the Buddha talks about as the first arrow, we often overlay a second arrow on top of that. And the second arrow is our suffering. And so that suffering is what it is that comes from the thinking about the pain. And these two arrows are something that is part of our mindfulness, part of our understanding. So we know life is difficult. We can't handle everything in the same way, but at the same time, we have to accept that pain is there. And in accepting that pain is there, we suffer less. In refusing to accept that pain is there, we suffer more. And that pain can be any number of different things, any number of different incidents out of our control. Things happen. We get into accidents, people leave us, there's financial ruin, there's suffering, there's death in all different types of lives. Nobody is immune from that. And so our suffering comes from how we relate to that, how we think about that. And this is where mindfulness comes in. This is where our practice can really support us. So I'd like to read you something that Thai wrote many, many years ago to help you understand how he processed suffering, how he personally managed through periods of suffering. It's funny how much our surroundings influence our emotions. Our joys and sorrows, likes and dislikes are colored by our environment so much that often we just let our surroundings dictate our course. We go along with public feelings until we no longer even know our true aspirations. We become a stranger to ourselves, molded entirely by society. Sometimes I feel caught between two opposing selves, the false self imposed by society and what I would call my true self. How often we confuse the two and assume society's mold to be our true self. Battles between our two selves rarely result in a peaceful reconciliation. Our mind becomes a battlefield on which the five aggregates, the forms, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness of our being, what we would consider to be me, are strewn about like debris in a hurricane. Trees topple, branches snap, houses crash. These are our loneliest moments. Yet every time we survive such a storm, we grow a little bit. Without storms like these, I would not be who I am today. But rarely I hear such a storm coming until it is already upon me. It seems to appear without warning, as though treading silently on silk slippers. I know it must have been brewing a long time, simmering in my own thoughts and mental formations, but when such a frenzied hurricane strikes, nothing outside can help. I'm battered and torn apart, and I am also saved. What Thai is saying here is that in the same moment that we feel some kind of drama or trauma or struggle or suffering, it's also the very moment that we can realize the truth of life and become free from it. We become saved. I have never been so alive as in the moment that I lost my child. In the death of my child, all of a sudden life became extremely vibrant, extremely intense and real. Because in that crystallized moment, you have a choice. And the choice is either washing yourself down the river of suffering and sorrow, or coming to this moment of realization, which is that I am alive in this moment. I'm alive in this moment. And this moment contains everything you need to be happy. And that's independent from the immediate need to cry and to feel sad and to process the shock and grief and emotions. That's not about bypassing these emotions. It's recognizing that in that moment, we are still alive. There's still something that we can recover from whatever suffering we might be exposed to, whatever pain, whatever damage we might be experiencing. Let's practice this now. Coming into this moment, come into the breath once again, just as we did. And as you breathe in, just bring your awareness to the breath. And as you breathe out, you bring your awareness to the breath once again. And you sense in this moment that you're alive. Your breathing is the proof that you're alive, because if you don't breathe in after breathing out, you know you're dead. That's it, you're done. So by breathing in, you know, aha, I'm still here. I'm still alive. And feel how wonderful it is to be alive in this moment. Feel how wonderful it is to receive this breath. Just receiving it. You're not doing that or creating that. You're not even asking for it. You're just receiving this breath. It's just life itself happening in this moment. Breathing in, I know I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I know I'm breathing out. And this is not an exercise of thinking about breathing. This is an exercise of being aware of your breath. We can be aware of the breath in any moment, whether your eyes are open or closed, and whether you're walking or sitting down, whether you're lying down feeling ill, or whether you're running around and feeling quite happy. Breathing in, I know I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I'm aware of my out breath. Breathing in, I'm aware of the sound of the bell. Breathing out, aware of the sound of the bell. Allow your eyes to remain closed for a moment. This is a poem that Thai wrote when he discovered that his village had been bombed for the third time by the US Army. It's called For Warmth. I hold my face between my hands. No, I'm not crying. I hold my face between my hands to keep my loneliness warm. Two hands protecting, two hands nourishing, two hands to prevent my soul from leaving me in anger. When we're in our deepest moment of suffering, we must come as close as we can to this moment rather than running away from it. We must really experience this moment. We experience it without judging it or wishing it were different. Fully experiencing this moment, we see this is where life is. And as long as you come back to this choice point in the moment, now you have some space. If you spend a lot of time regretting or being angry at or feeling frustration with whatever is experiencing, whatever you're going through in this moment, you're wasting all of that precious life. It's all in the mind. It's not really happening. And when you come close to understanding and you feel your experience of suffering, and you feel the rawness of the pain, now you're in a situation where you're fully alive and noticing in that moment that it doesn't last. In that moment of recognition, just like in the moment where we were sitting in the awareness of the body, just being aware, not willing anything to be different. In that awareness of the body or this crucial moment in time, there's something that shifts. There's something that happens because nothing stays forever. To understand this, we take the context of the Four Noble Truths, which are the first teaching of the Buddha. This is what is known as the turning of the wheel of Dharma. When the Buddha historically gave his first teaching, this is what he wanted people to know. The first noble truth is that life entails suffering, dukkha. It's unavoidable. We're born into suffering. It hurts to be born. We experience suffering through so many different moments of our lives in so many different ways. And the Buddha identified causes of suffering. This was very important to understand the causes of suffering. And originally, he pointed to two things: our attachments and our aversion. Aversion to things that we didn't like, refusal to accept things, not wanting things to be the way that they are, or the attachment to things being a certain way, always wanting them to remain the same. Those are the root causes of suffering. Later, he identified a number of emotions, negative emotions like anger, jealousy, fear, as causes of suffering. But it always boils down to aversion and attachment. And the third noble truth is that there is an end to suffering. This is the good news. Suffering is there. We know why. And because we know why, now we know that there's an end to the suffering if we know how to take care of it. This is the meaning of nirvana, what in a yogic tradition might be called moksha, liberation, freedom from suffering. It doesn't mean the end of life. It's not the end of a living being. It's the end of a misperception about life. Freedom from suffering is nirvana. And the fourth noble truth, very important to us here, is how do we get there? There's a way, there's a path, the marga. This is the path to end suffering that the Buddha outlined. And this is where we find ourselves right now. There's an eightfold path, which is the way to end suffering. Right view, right thinking, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right diligence, right mindfulness, and right concentration. When we understand that all of these eight things fit together in an interconnected way, that they can't be extracted, they can't be taken out of context, then we understand why in modern times, some people can say that mindfulness doesn't work. There's even a certain amount of evidence that is growing that mindfulness is causing anxiety, causing stress in people. Especially about a year ago, there was quite a lot of literature that came out to indicate that there was some people who were suffering a lot from anxiety attacks or panic attacks when they would supposedly be sitting and meditating. But I'd like to point out that this is not mindfulness. This is what I would call McMindfulness, this modern version of mindfulness, which means that nothing else matters but paying attention. And we can't extract it from the rest of the 8 limbs that are a necessary component of really truly ending suffering in life. So if we're using mindfulness just to pay attention, just to sit down and be calm and pay attention to what's going on, there can be a lack of control of the mind, where the mind starts to take over. And what we end up doing is sitting down and thinking. We can't have a panic attack without thinking. It's just impossible. The panic attack comes from thinking. It's coming from allowing the mind to overcome the senses and therefore generating stress over a long period of time. It doesn't happen spontaneously. So I'm only going to talk about 3 things here: right view, right thinking, and right mindfulness. But I'll give you a very quick definition of the others. So right view we'll see in detail, right thinking, same thing. Right speech is where we're aware of the impact of our words, aware of the things that we say. And this morning with a student of mine, I have a private student doing mindfulness training each Sunday morning. And we talked about this right speech, talking about how when we're not in integrity with what we say, and what we say is out of step with what we do, we both lose our own self-esteem, but also the esteem of others. So we start to erode in our sense of self, which, although it's temporary and actually an illusion, is really important to the capacity to live with integrity and do anything else and with any kind of significance in our life, any kind of power. And the example that we used was to say to somebody, yeah, we should really go out for lunch sometime. And there's an understanding that that's not a real commitment, that that's something of a polite or semi-polite throwaway kind of comment. And it seems really anodyne, but really what it is saying, I'll say something and it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything. It would be just as pleasant to hear, it was lovely to see you, see you again sometime, have a good day, whatever. You don't have to make a promise of something coming that you have no intention of keeping. And the paradox is that both people in the conversation know that that's not really true. And so it leaves everybody with a feeling of dissatisfaction, a feeling of dishonesty or kind of a fakeness. And this is that kind of social identity that Thich was alluding to earlier. And so right speech leads to right action. So the way that we speak dictates how we act. So the way we think leads to the speech, the action follows the speech. And so right action is about non-harming fundamentally. But it's also just keeping in our awareness what is the result of what we do, who is affected by what we do, for example. If we take the example of trying not to harm and therefore adjusting the way that we eat in a way that doesn't harm the planet or doesn't harm other living beings, that would be right action, for example. And then right livelihood, the way that we earn money matters, because not only are we taking money from a particular source that has an energy on its own, so that we're receiving that energy into our lives, but we're also contributing something to that energy. And if the way that we earn our money is actually toxic to society or toxic to the environment or toxic to other human beings, then this can't be described as right livelihood. Right diligence is about being consistent and having a practice. It's about doing the things that we say we're going to do. It's about participating. This is where Thai started to develop the idea of engaged Buddhism. This idea of engaged Buddhism comes from right diligence. It's knowing that something's happening and knowing I have the skills and the time and the commitment to doing something about it. That's right diligence. And that can include anything small, like taking some time to relax the body, making oneself feel more at ease in themselves so they become more easeful in life. And then right mindfulness comes. Mindfulness is the awareness of what we're doing in this moment, being here in this moment, aware of this sense of self, aware of the breathing, aware of what's happening around us. That paying attention is not thinking about things. It's not having a conversation internally about what's happening. It's just an awareness of what's happening. In this moment, become aware of your body. Become aware of where your mind is in this moment. Are you breathing? How does the body feel? How are you experiencing this moment? Are you present fully, or are you multitasking? And then right concentration at the very end of the list, right concentration brings us into the practice of meditation. Concentration is focusing the mind, bringing our attention, for example, through the breathing to a place where we're no longer in a space of thinking, but we're in a space of understanding. You'll notice that there are times in your life when you learn really important lessons, and not by thinking about them, not by learning something in that intellectual way, but by really understanding something. And it kind of drops in of realization. And that can happen only when we're paying attention. Right? Concentration is about paying attention. We pay attention deliberately when we sit and meditate, but also paying attention, that is the energy of mindfulness. So mindfulness itself is the practice of reducing pain and suffering and generating a feeling of joy and happiness. We can't extract it from the other practices. It's not sufficient to pay attention to what's going on if we don't also have a practice of ethics and a practice of deep listening and deep understanding of the reality of the world that we live in. We can reduce the pain and suffering by following those steps. And we can generate joy and happiness by cultivating an awareness in that direction. So I'm going to share a little bit more with that in mind today. Right view, which is the first of the Eightfold Path, is really important because what it helps us understand is that most of the time we don't have right view. So most of the time we actually are misperceiving, our perceptions are wrong. We're not perceiving the nature of life itself correctly. And yet we base a lot of our actions on those things being true. In the most fundamental way, when we understand right view and we understand the nature of life, we understand that we are deeply interconnected, that there's nothing that is isolated. There is what is known in the Buddhist tradition as dependent arising. We emerge out of a number of things that are not me, for example. I am made up of things that are non-me elements. We can go back, for example, into our ancestry and see that we are also made up of all of our ancestors. We can't deny that. If we act as if we are an isolated unit and we disconnect from understanding our ancestors, and that includes their suffering, then we suffer. We become an isolated, or we believe we're an isolated unit that has to take care of itself without understanding the support that we can get from recognizing our interconnectivity. And in the same way, we won't generate more suffering when we understand that we're connected to all other beings. Our interconnected nature is there as a fact of life. And if we think that we operate in isolation, then we're always going to behave in a way that causes suffering because we only see our own needs. So this kind of selfish need, this selfish desire for things, blocks us from seeing how what we do affects the people around us. And that doesn't just include our family members or the neighbors or the people we actually see. It has an effect that spreads out far and wide in ways that we can't predict. So understanding right view also contains all of the other elements of the Eightfold Path. It also contains our understanding of our need to act with integrity, for example. It contains our need to be aware of what we're doing. So all of these elements are like building blocks that can't be separated out. Or like DNA in a strand, we can't just have one element of DNA and consider that we're complete. We need the whole sequence of DNA to consider that we're complete. So right view is extremely important. Right view also helps us to understand suffering. When we truly understand suffering, we can start to see it everywhere. This was the gift that Thai gave to me. That we understand that what is driving behavior is suffering, that what is behind so much destruction and what is, what we see on the news every day, what we see in terms of interpersonal behavior is all driven by suffering. And so really looking deeply at the root cause of suffering, we see suffering. We see the suffering in the other. And when we can touch on the suffering in another, we can see that we're also suffering. And until we're able to touch on our own suffering, we're not able to be with somebody else who's in suffering. So for example, if we're not able to understand and be with our own anger, we can't be around angry people. And then we blame the angry people and we say it's their fault. We say they're difficult to be around, I can't be around them. But really what it is that it's our aversion to our own anger that makes it difficult to be with another angry person. So once we can practice looking deeply and really understanding with this right view, understanding that there's anger in me, I can be with that anger in the way that we were earlier as we were paying attention to our breathing, feeling the body, just listening, then that allows us to be with whatever's going on around us without having to feel so triggered and so touched by what's going on. Then we become an agent for change. There's something there then that allows us to release our own suffering so we can be with the suffering of others. This is the stepping stone to true compassion. And we'll talk about that again too. This is my favorite of all of my calligraphies from Thai. Are you sure? When we want to understand right thinking, we keep in mind the right view. So we can't just understand right view intellectually and say, yes, 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 we're all interconnected. There's nothing I can do that won't affect somebody else and vice versa. When we understand right thinking, we recognize that we also have to act upon the understanding of right view in the way that we are considering what's going on. So right thinking is about being aware of what we're aware of and acting upon that. Recognizing I may not have all of the elements of understanding. I may not have enough information to make a judgment. I may not understand either this person or this situation fully, and therefore I need to consider it more deeply. So again, we see that we can't extract right thinking out from the rest of the sequence either. We still require all of those elements to really fully grasp the solution to suffering. Recognizing that often we're wrong and that our thinking is often either too hasty or misguided, or we've misjudged the situation, is the first step to right thinking. It's the first step towards correcting that mistake. And you'll probably notice by now that all of this path, to this mindful path, or this path towards alleviation of suffering, requires a lot of humility. It requires us to say, I see where I've been wrong. I see where I've made mistakes. And I see where I've misjudged, or where I've jumped to a conclusion without understanding all of the information. And when we understand that when we do something like that, we cause harm, it becomes urgent to question our thinking. So if we look at how polarized things are in our world now, particularly on the internet space, social media space, we can recognize this violence. We feel it viscerally when we go onto social media, or we watch the news and we watch people interacting with each other in this very polarized way. This feeling of right and wrong, fair and unfair, good and bad, moral and immoral, all of that is putting us in a space of wrong thinking. We don't know. When we hold that space of I don't know, then we're open to learning. We have to listen to the other and understand the suffering of the other before we can fully grasp the situation. And as part of healing our own suffering, we pay attention to our suffering, listen to the suffering that we're experiencing, so that we create the capacity to listen to the suffering of others. And the more that we do this on a regular basis, the easier that becomes second nature, if you really invest in that practice. It is urgent to do in situations where there's a family breakdown, or where there's a breakdown in communications with your neighbors, or between countries. People's lives can hang in the balance when we're acting on wrong thinking. So this is a part of our practice that cannot be extracted from mindfulness practice. If I come back to this, these studies that claim that mindfulness can actually cause anxiety or leads to people having obsessive compulsive disorder, that's wrong thinking. That's not understanding the meaning of mindfulness, and that is because there's an element missing, which is that we have to question our thoughts. We shouldn't believe our thoughts. So if you sit on your mat, you sit on your cushion, and you ruminate for 30 minutes every day, this is going to cause a lot of stress, cause a lot of suffering, causes a lot of torment, because you've already come with the misunderstanding of what it is that is available to you, and you're relying on the mind to dictate how you feel and dictate the quality of the moment. So what we want to understand is this moment is without the mind. It already is. It exists in this original form, this unique form that it's emerging into, and we can only be aware of this moment. At the moment we start thinking, we're no longer in this moment. We're in a future moment, or we're in a past rumination. And that's helpful and practical. We're not at all saying that the mind is not useful. The question is, at what point do you rely on your mind, and do you trust the judgment of your mind? And this requires this regular reflection about, am I sure? This right thinking. Can I trust my mind? Or should I go down that train of thought? This is the temple in Hue, where Thich Nhat Hanh started his monastic career as a very young child. And this is the temple from which he emerged just a couple of weeks ago to be cremated. So that middle door was open for him to pass. That's a special door that is only opened on certain occasions, for example, like the passing of a member of the community. The temple doors themselves actually represent the 3 Dharma seals, or sometimes they're called the Dharma doors. And those seals are impermanence, non-self, and nirvana. So all of what I've just said now about these aspects of the Eightfold Path are can be summarized in a way by understanding the notion of impermanence, non-self, and nirvana. When we've truly grasped that nothing lasts forever, then we can be in suffering with more ease and more space. We can recognize right away, this is just a transformation. This is a change of form. When we're grasping, again, there's that word Buddha says that we suffer because we're grasping, hoping things will remain the same. When we're grasping and trying to keep things the same, we're not understanding the truth of impermanence. The truth of impermanence is understood with our breath. So literally when we're breathing, we can sense impermanence. Breathing in naturally is followed by breathing out. Just try it for a moment. Try to breathe in, keep breathing in, breathe in some more, carry on breathing in, just go deeper into your breath and maybe get to the point where there's no more space to breathe in, but hold the breath. And start to understand just to what extent you actually wish for impermanence. To what extent are you craving now transformation? Once you've exhaled, same thing, just carry on. Just exhale and exhale, exhale some more. Let the breath go, keep letting it go. And start to feel at a certain point, it's not possible anymore. I can't actually survive if I continue to exhale. This is literally how we die. We exhale, we never inhale again. So we're now wanting that inhalation. We want that next thing. In the process of breathing, as we go like this, inhaling, exhaling, often totally unconsciously, most often, in the process of breathing, we're also transforming physically. That every cell in our body, those 5 aggregates that we saw earlier on, every aspect of our physical self and our thoughts and all of the energy that goes with that is constantly transforming, trillions of cells transforming in the space of time that we've already been together, constantly. Imagine yourself never throwing away rubbish. Imagine the state of your house if you never took out the garbage. So impermanence is the nature of life. It's the way that we are, and it is in every aspect of life. We can't expect it to be in some parts of life and not in others. So when we practice with the understanding of impermanence, we also practice letting go. We practice letting go of the other. We practice letting go of relationship. We practice letting go of success, letting go of the idea of success. This makes us extremely powerful because we become resilient to all of the changes that are inevitably going to happen. The other aspect of the Dharma seals that very important is the non-self. This is what could also be described as interbeing, what Thich calls interbeing. There is no separate self. We are, again, as I said earlier, this kind of agglomeration of different factors that coincide and that occur in a space and time. And there is no separate me, although we have through the mind a sense of self. We have this egoic identity, and that's very practical. On a social level, we can engage with each other. We can say, this is my language, this is my address, this is the thing that I like to do in my life. And all of that is subject to impermanence. So the self is also a construction that is not true and always subject to impermanence. And then nirvana is the other dharma door, is the other understanding, when you understand these three things together, you're free. Nirvana is the capacity to see clearly, the capacity to understand all of what I've just described as the reality, the ground of being, the ground of reality that we live with, and being free of it all. And recognizing that, yes, there will be pain. Yes, there will be times when life is not easy. And I continue, and my continuation continues. And all of the actions that I have done and all of the things that I have accomplished in my life continue in the energy sequentially that is set in motion by my body, speech, and mind. And this is a wonderful gatha, which is the embodiment of that sense of impermanence. The tears I shed yesterday have become rain. So this is the very first, this is an image of it. This is not the one that I have, but this is the very first calligraphy that I bought of Thais when I went to Plum Village the first time. And it struck me very powerfully because at that time I had just gone through a few years of incredible change. And there was this feeling of constant transition, the loss of a child, then the sense of betrayal in my marriage, and then the marriage breaking down, and then the end of the marriage, and so on. It was just one thing after another in this very intense way. And the one thing that was constant throughout of it, that whole period of time, was the fact that something new was emerging in the space of whatever left. There was never an absence. There was never something that just left and then left a big hole, because it's just not possible. And so there was this feeling of just rolling, if you like. That was the way I could describe it, this kind of rolling like a forward momentum through life. And seeing that this one thing led to another, to a different form. That was not necessarily a better form, it was different. It was just different. And that I could choose to stay with the mistaken idea that things should be a different way, or that they should remain the way that I wanted them to be, or the way that they were temporarily appearing to be. Or I could choose to really go with this rolling and flexible, open approach to life. And that is what really healed me. It's what allowed me to move through those very, very challenging years with a feeling of real aliveness, real grace and aliveness. So while there's an art of suffering, there's also an art of happiness. And our suffering is possible to transform as long as we understand how. It's important to remember what I've just described about the understanding of reality and the understanding of how we engage with reality, how we understand the quality of life itself through impermanence, through the recognition that I am not a separate self, that there's a bunch of factors that have to arise simultaneously for me to even appear in this world. And the same goes for every other situation, and that all of it is temporary and can disappear in a moment. And when we understand that, and we understand how to cultivate a sense of ease within that, we now know the art of happiness. Be free where you are is another thing that Thai wanted to teach us through his gathas. Being free where you are right now in this moment is waking up to this moment and choosing freedom. That you drop the story, that you drop the resistance, that you recognize that in this moment, you already are free. The only thing keeping you stuck or attached to this moment is a thought. And now we understand those thoughts are not real. Many of our thoughts can't be trusted. Be free where you are. Thai used to send many of his books, thousands and thousands of books, to prisons around the world, particularly in the US, where there's actually an organization that does that. And he would be very specific and say, you're perhaps sitting in a prison cell, but you can be free in your prison cell. You can choose the way that you engage with life. You can choose how you perceive your life and whether or not you feel free in your life. For this, there's a wonderful story of Nelson Mandela, who was in solitary confinement for a long, long time, imprisoned for 27 years, and most of that in solitary confinement as a political prisoner. And Nelson Mandela said one day, early on in his imprisonment, he realized that the only way he could get cigarettes, because he was a smoker in those days, the only way he could get cigarettes was by getting them from the guards. So the guards had a certain power over him. If he did something they didn't like, or if they were in a bad mood, they wouldn't give him cigarettes, and he would want those cigarettes. And so he realized that the only way that he could release himself from at least that control of the guards was to stop smoking. Be free where you are. That freedom of not being a slave to a craving or a desire or a want is where you'll really relieve a lot of your suffering. We think of things that should make us happy: money, love, sex, people in our lives, objects. And at the same time, those objects and people and activities actually cause us suffering. Because when we don't have them, or we don't have them on our terms, we suffer. So the very thing that we crave is the source of our suffering. We can't have one without the other. It's always like this. There's no exception to that. So as we cultivate joy and happiness and ease in our life, we're going to practice in a way that brings up the four qualities that will bring us the true compassion or the true happiness that we're looking for. The four Brahma Viharas. These are sometimes translated as the immeasurables. They're so wonderful. They're so perfect in their expression that they naturally bring about happiness. They naturally bring about a sense of connection and joy and ease. And so this is part of the practice. This is what we're moving towards, to cultivate the happiness from the suffering that is inevitable in our life, or the suffering that is present in our life. So metta, loving kindness, also maitri in Sanskrit, is a softening of the heart and a feeling of friendliness or goodwill towards others. And we want to feel that towards ourselves. So when we're sitting in our practice, or when we're aware of whatever suffering we're having, we cultivate this feeling of loving ourselves. We're taking care of ourselves. If you're a doctor or a parent or somebody who's got a position of responsibility and you're not in a good place, you can't take care of other people. And if your commitment or your responsibility is to take care of other people, well, you're not going to be able to do that, and you cause more suffering in yourself and others. So we, as a priority, have to take care of ourselves. Thai used to say that if a teacher, one of the teachers that would be at Plum Village or in the various countries around the world where his teachers were, if they were not in a good place, they had to stop teaching. They had to take care of themselves, take care of their emotions, their experience of life, take care of their physical health. And only when they felt better could they come back and teach again. That's not punishment. It's not saying that there's something wrong. It's just pointing to the obvious. We can't give what we don't have. And so cultivating loving kindness is a way of nourishing ourselves. It's a way of taking care of ourselves and offering friendliness and compassion to people around us. Compassion is a natural outpouring again of loving kindness. So again, we can't extract one from the other. Notice that all of these things are inextricably linked, because of course you know now that nothing is independent, nothing arises in and of itself. So karuna, compassion, is wanting to remove suffering from others, and it's not the same as pity. We can't cultivate compassion if we haven't taken care of ourselves. We can't cultivate true compassion if we're feeling in a bad place, or if we're in a place of judgment. Because then when we're engaging in that, we're pitying the other. And that puts us in the illusion of hierarchy. Then we feel superior to another person. And we can't help somebody that we don't feel connected to. So developing this sense of compassion for yourself, for your own suffering, and then for the suffering that you see around you through this compassion is a simultaneous practice. Compassion for yourself, compassion for others. It arises spontaneously because we see that we all suffer. And some of us suffer more because we don't understand how to take care of our suffering. We don't understand how to take care of our pain. If a baby is crying, you pick up the baby. So this sounds kind of absurd, but you don't stand around thinking about why the baby might be crying. You don't stand around trying to analyze why the baby might be crying. You pick up the baby. And in the act of picking up the crying baby, something shifts. Now the baby becomes more calm. You also become more calm because the parents feel distress or the caregivers feel distress when a child is distressed. And we understand that now we see things differently. Now we can understand the suffering from a place of more wisdom. So in the same way with our own suffering, with whatever's going on with us, we have to start to take care of it. We bring ourselves to a point of loving kindness towards ourselves and compassion towards ourselves. Then we can manage the suffering. Then we can understand it and take action appropriately. So we're not reaching out to help others because there's something flawed or wrong with others. It's not because we're a great person that we do that. It's because we understand their suffering. We understand and we want, because we understand what suffering is, we want to stop it in other people. We want that suffering to end, and so we try to mitigate it for other people. Mudita is sympathetic joy, or a joy that arises because of someone else's joy. When somebody else is having a wonderful moment or they're experiencing something really lovely in their lives, when we feel that joy for them, that happiness for them, we are experiencing it as if it were ours. Because again, remember, nothing separates us from anyone else. If we cut ourselves off from that and we become jealous and critical, wishing them ill, wishing them failure, we also start to feel harsh and critical and judgmental. We feel this kind of disconnection from others. We feel less supported. We feel unhappy. So we can't cultivate happiness for ourselves without cultivating that for others as well. We wish happiness all around us. We wish that joy could continue for one's whole life as much as is possible. So we wish that mudita to arise spontaneously in ourselves and in others. Upeka or upeksha in Sanskrit is equanimity. It's understanding through wisdom that whatever is happening, good or bad, it's going to change because we understand the notion of impermanence. We understand that impermanence is the nature of life itself. And so we don't worry about focusing, is this good or is this bad? It's just what it is right now. And when we embrace that situation as it is, it's like embracing that crying baby, the upset, this feeling of discontent or this feeling of fear and pain. We just embrace it. And we recognize, yes, it's there. And it will also pass. And it's also subject to the nature of impermanence. And then we can start to ease into what we'd like to do about that. How do we choose differently? If we don't, we are stuck in the problem. We're stuck in the judgment of good or bad. And we're no longer able to see clearly. So we don't have right view or right thinking. You have enough. There's a funny story that goes with this particular gatha, with this particular calligraphy, which is that I was one time at Plum Village where I just decided I absolutely had to have the smile. There was this lovely, you've probably seen it, this lovely smile calligraphy. And all of a sudden, I just realized I want to buy that. I have to have it before I leave. And I had seen it before. I had seen it a couple of days before. So I ran to the bookshop as soon as I could, because it's not always open. It's open a couple of hours a day. I ran to the bookshop and I started to go through all the calligraphies. In those days, they were open. You could just choose the one that you wanted. You could just leaf through them. And I couldn't find it. And I couldn't find it. And I kept seeing, you have enough. I kept going, oh, that's not the one I want. You have enough. You have enough. And I just kept going through them, paper after paper after paper. I went through the next drawer. They were all in these drawers, kind of like architect's drawers. I went through again and again and again, all these drawers. You have enough. You have enough. Nobody seemed to want to buy this one. Everybody bought the smile one and whatever. I was getting more and more frustrated. And then finally, it just dawned on me. You have enough. And I had to laugh out loud. I just got it. It's probably also why nobody else was buying this one, because it's enough. And then you start to realize, as Tai says, that we already here and now, at this moment, we have enough conditions to be happy. We have all the conditions that we need to be happy in this moment, without exception. If you're breathing, you're still alive. If you can still breathe in, life is still there for you. And in that moment of realization, we recognize, okay, life is a miracle. That we're here, it's a miracle. It's already an extraordinary chance that we're even born as a human being. And we have enough. Not only do we have enough stuff, we have enough conditions to be happy in this moment, exactly as we are, regardless of what seem to be the outer circumstances. The 5 remembrances help us to see the true nature of life and through that impermanence. I am of the nature to grow old. There's no way to escape growing old. I'm of the nature to have ill health. There's no way to escape having ill health. I am of the nature to die. There's no way to escape death. If you're born, you're going to die. That's just the way that goes. That applies to everybody. This is the suffering that the Buddha was addressing. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. We can't expect somebody to be the same all the way through life. We can't expect them to behave in the same way, even from one moment of the day to the next, because they are evolving in their understanding and their relationship to life as well. And their nature is to change in the form of death as well. So the end of this physical appearance and the transition towards a new appearance. So there's no way of being, there's no way we can escape being disconnected from them or separated from them. There's no way we can keep them permanently in our orbit. And very importantly, I inherit the results of my actions of body, speech, and mind. My actions are my continuation. So rather than focusing on the stuff that we have, all of the belongings and the things that we like, which can be fun, there's nothing wrong with having stuff, but we focus instead on what is the result of my actions. And if I'm acting according to right understanding, if we have this right speech and this right thinking and right mindfulness, we will leave behind a continuation or a legacy that is going to alleviate suffering rather than cause suffering, that's going to be of benefit to other people. That will be unique, it'll be different according to each of us. The 3 jewels are very important here to understand how to manage all of what I've just said here. The 3 jewels are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Buddha is the nature of the teacher. So it can be the historical Buddha. It doesn't have to be. Buddhism is not a religion. It's not something that you need to subscribe to. There's no dogma. There is an understanding. So you get the understanding by being exposed to the right teacher. And once you understand that teacher is a reference for you. You don't cling to the teacher. It's not a permanent connection. It's taking the teachings from the teacher and honoring the teacher at the same time with the remembrance of impermanence. So the Buddha is very important, getting the right teaching from the teacher. The dharma is the path. This is what the Buddha called the Eightfold Path, or any other dharma that is a practice that leads you towards the truth. That you have a means to alleviate suffering. You have a means to understand the true nature of life. So what, again, in yoga would be considered the goal of moksha, or freedom, liberation from this life, the Buddha would describe as freedom from suffering, nirvana. And the Sangha is very important. The Sangha is the people surrounding you. If you are surrounded by people who share the same goals, same view, same ambitions, and seek to uplift you and help you, you'll have much more success on this path than if you're surrounded by people who are negative or ignorant or not understanding. And that doesn't mean that you should walk away from people like that. It doesn't mean that you should exclude people like that. There's no issue, again, around superiority. It's around understanding what is required to support you on your path. In the moment of great suffering, one of the ways to cultivate healing and to move towards happiness is to surround yourself by the Sangha that you need. And that Sangha doesn't have to, it's not a particular Sangha, it's your Sangha. Who is that? Who are your people? Who are the people that bring you away from suffering and towards happiness? So this is the moment. This is life itself. There's no better moment. If you sit in this moment and just be in this energy right now, exactly as you are in the fullness of your life. There's no better future. There's no future that will be somehow superior because now you're just preparing for the future. This is your life. This is where it's happening. One of the teachings of the Buddha was to practice dying in every moment. This is why these understandings, the remembrances of our fragile life are very important, not to become morbid and think about dying, but rather to recognize that we will die and we don't know how. We have no idea when or the nature of our death. And so we cultivate that understanding. This is the moment that I'm alive. What is the quality of this moment? The Buddha said you could die in this moment. So is this how you want to die? The way you are, exactly as you are right now, is the way that you will die. Because every moment, as you cultivate this moment, is the cause of the future moment. So you're setting yourself up by how you are exactly as you are right now for every moment to come. So this is it. There's no better moment. So taking a good deep breath in this moment, smile at this moment, and recognize that you're here now. This is where life is happening. So thank you for staying with that. I thought I would do a little presentation like that. It's more perhaps visually supporting my talking head. If you have any questions, or if you want to explore the notion of suffering, this would be a great time to do that. So do go ahead and unmute yourself, or you can write it in the chat.
Susan, just to thank you for this beautiful sharing.
Thank you, Agnieszka.
Profound, and it touched me deeply. And when you shared your own experiences, they resonated with me, and I felt that in my body. So thank you very much for being so open and kind, and for all the teachings that you have received and passing to us. It's really precious. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. You see, you are all the continuation of this teaching. You see, the fact that you're actually here, it's you are that. You see, it's not like it stops just because somebody has done something before you. You're taking this and now you're the continuation. So then the question is, how do I live my life in that? It's not an obligation. It's not like now I've taken on this duty or this burden and now I have to be the continuation of this. It's just, oh yeah, I am also the continuation of this understanding. And when you start to recognize it, when you get close to that understanding, the suffering comes from ignoring it. So the suffering before was great because you didn't know. The suffering was born of ignorance. But once you do know, once you understand something and you've really started to process that, the suffering increases because now you know and you still act in ignorance. And this is why we have to develop a regular practice, not again under any obligation to anyone, but rather to yourself to avoid further suffering. The regular practice can look very different, doesn't have to look in a particular way, but if you don't deliberately choose to spend time alone with yourself and to spend time feeling what's happening in my life in this moment, what am I actually experiencing in this moment, you're never going to be able to fully participate when things are difficult, when you're engaging in the rest of life. It's impossible because you'll be still stuck with a feeling of incompleteness or a feeling of wanting to avoid pain. If I give you an example, this is not related personally, by the way, this is just a general example to anyone that might be interested, is that the example of, say, animal rights defenders or vegans who have that as their foundation, which is again a very noble cause. It's not about saying this is good or bad, but what can happen is they can cause themselves an immense amount of suffering, and they cause themselves the suffering because they are so resistant to their own relationship to suffering that they project that, and so their inability to be with the animals suffering actually prevents them from effectively helping the animals to suffer less. I hope I'm making sense. So the intention is to alleviate suffering, but the problem is that they're so focused on they're pointing the fingers of blame outwardly. They're pointing the fingers of blame rather than also connecting to their own suffering. This is the difference between, for example, when Thai went to the United States in the 60s, Thai refused to join the anti-war protests. He refused. He said, I won't do it. If you want, I'll march for peace. He said, I'll absolutely march for peace. Let's go. Peace is every step. And the reason being, because if we're anti something, we're pushing against it. We're in that space of exactly where the Buddha told us we would find suffering. We're pushing against something. We don't want it. We're resisting it. It's wrong. It's bad. Rather than just having the understanding, this is what is happening. And now connecting to our own feelings around that, taking care of our feelings like that crying baby, and recognizing this is how I could contribute. This is how I could then alleviate the suffering. So it's no longer pushing against that thing on the outside. Now it's saying, how can I also contribute? How can I be a force for transformation? I hope that's coming across. It's a very difficult one to grapple with because we tend to live our lives, and particularly with Western religions in general, there's a highly moralistic component, which is different to ethics. The moralistic component is a judgment. It's a sense of what is right and wrong. It's about fair and unfair. And the truth of life is that it's highly impersonal. Life is always impersonal. There are things that are happening, and there are ways that we can engage or disengage with things that are happening. But it's not about us. It never was, regardless. Even if it's your most intimate partner, that's something that's going on with, it's still not about you. It has a lot to do with what's going on in their own head, for example. So once we start to understand that, we can start to realize, okay, there's some things I want to accomplish, But actually, my emotionalism or my personal investment, my mistaken personal investment in all of this is causing me to be weaker than I could be if I were to really engage at the level of wanting to alleviate suffering or wanting to cause change. I would have to be different. This is why Thai made such an impact, because it's all about recognizing your own pain, recognizing your own suffering. He did this in Israel, brought Palestinians and Israelis all the way to Plum Village. And for the first week, they had a 3-week retreat. For the first week, the two groups stayed separately. There are 3 hamlets. They stayed separately, one in each hamlet. So they didn't see each other. They practiced recognizing their own suffering and taking care of their own suffering. The second week, then they had one party, one side sharing. And the third week, they had the other side sharing. So practicing deep listening is also very important. Listening to yourself and listening to the suffering of others to understand. Even if we look at something, we say, that's just wrong, that's not okay, we still benefit from understanding the motive behind it. Why? Why would somebody do that? And look for the principal cause, the principal motive. It'll be connected to suffering. So then we use that as the ground of action rather than the behavior or the condemning the individuals, which will prevent any kind of change. So this is a cultural shift. It's something that is very difficult to practice because our society is built so differently. Our society is built on this polarization. And especially in the last few decades, people profit from our polarization. There's an entire military industrial complex that profits enormously from conflict and blame, that profits from misinformation. The same can be said of social media. There's a profit to be made by generating conflict and misunderstanding. So you start to understand that the most important thing to keep things ticking along in harmony and towards progress, towards real alleviation of suffering, is understanding the suffering, both in yourself and in others, and being able to sit with it. Being able to sit with someone else's suffering requires that you understand your own, so that you don't make it all about you. A lot of people, for example, now in the last couple of years, where we've seen such enormous devastation, whether it be medical, physical, through the pandemic itself, or through the economic influence of the pandemic that's caused so much pain and suffering, and they break down, they can't actually hold it. It's overwhelming. The suffering feels overwhelming. And then on top of that, there's wars and all these other things. And the most important thing to understand is, as soon as if you sense that feeling of overwhelm, it's a sign, like a little red flag that says you're not taking care of yourself. And that should not be interpreted as a selfish act. It should be interpreted as the first thing that is necessary to be able to engage in some kind of constructive way socially. When we take care of ourselves, then we can help. If you're having a heart attack and you've got like the paramedics arriving at your door, can you imagine if they arrived into your living room while you're lying on the floor having a heart attack, and they're freaking out because they can't stand the fact that you're having a heart attack? They can't cope. They're hysterical. They're excited, and they're dropping their tools and unable to do anything for you. We look at that and we say, but that's so absurd. That's crazy. Of course, that's a stupid example, but that's how we are. That's how many people live their lives. We have to take care of ourselves so that we don't create a mess around us. We have to practice understanding our own suffering. And then we can go way, way back. We go back through our family, go back through our culture, through our whatever connection we feel with people around us. Where's the suffering there? Can I touch on that suffering? We carry the suffering of our ancestors. We can't pretend that we just kind of pop up in this form. There's a wonderful Zen koan, which is, where were you the day your grandmother was born? If you really think about that, where were you the day your grandmother was born? Wow. And now, interestingly, Scientifically, we know that actually the little ovum that you were made from was already being formed in your grandmother 2 generations back. Can you imagine? So that matters. It matters what your grandmother was up to and how she experienced her birth and her life and her death. It matters, even if you never knew her. And we can go back and back and back and back, all those generations. It's all there in us. And any generation that's not taking care of its suffering is going to condemn the next generation to suffer. We see that in front of our eyes. We see it all over. There's no one culture that is doing this that another is not. This is happening everywhere in the world. So if we really understand our own pain, we start to see it in other people, and then we can help. Then we can do it because now we're connected to that person. Now we can feel compassion, true compassion. We're not sitting in our isolated little world saying, woe is me. Life is hard. Life is hard. That's what the Buddha told us. There's no, people who say, oh, it's so negative. It's very nihilistic. This idea that there's no self. It's not nihilistic. It's understanding that there's a participation in life itself that we cannot avoid. So we can't pretend that we're some kind of island. There are terms we could use from a psychological place. We can cultivate an island in ourselves, which is helpful. We can cultivate this feeling of, I come back to my breath, I come back to my body, nobody else is feeling your body. Only you can feel your body. That's your little island, but it's just an image. We know that it's not true. It's just a method, a tool that we can use to practice. But when we believe that it's true, when we believe that we're an isolated creature and we can somehow separate ourselves out from suffering and pretend it's not happening, that's when you get into this kind of what we call, was called spiritual bypassing about 50 years ago. And this idea that you can somehow do all of the surface things. You can wear all the beads and do all the practices and do all the oming and so on, but you can't stand the energy of this room, or you can't be with those people, or you can't, whatever, because somehow you're not the same as them. And so understanding that's coming from that individual's suffering or misunderstanding of our connection, we can see where this mistaken idea comes from, that the other is causing my discomfort. We see this, unfortunately, quite dramatic in a really accelerated way in the last generation or two. We see this incredible attachment to form and an attachment to an idea that we should somehow be comfortable. One of the biggest problems in life is thinking that we shouldn't have problems. So if we understand that that's inherent to life, it's like, yeah, this is one of the things. That's part of the deal. And then you can more quickly process what this looks like. You quickly go through it and you emerge back into a place of constructive joy and connection and continuation from this place of understanding. Can you think of any other examples, suffering and how to understand suffering, including what's going on in the world now? Can you imagine what this world would be like if children really understood that? If children really got this in school rather than learning, facts. You could learn how to be a human being. And that would only be possible, of course, if the parents were also practicing how to be a human being engaged in life. I used to have a lot of people send me their kids when I would teach yoga to more like teens, not really children, but teenagers. People would ask me, would you do mindfulness for teens, or my daughter needs to go to yoga. And my response was always, you're setting the agenda for your children. You model in every moment what it's like to live your life. So you can't sort of, outsource that. You can't say, I'll do whatever I want, carry on with the chaos and anger and resentment and, selfishness, but then send my kids off and say, sort yourself out. You're cramping my style. You're making my life hard by being difficult, by not understanding. You're making me suffer. So again, we come back again and again and again to taking care of our own suffering. And there's nothing to fix here. That's the one of the first things I say when I start the mindfulness course, is that you're here now to expand into yourself and understand yourself. You're not here to fix yourself. There's nothing wrong and nothing to fix. It's all about understanding, getting a level of deep awareness of life and of yourself. And again, if you go with that approach of, I've got to fix something, it's coming from a place of ignoring what's in me that I'm not accepting, and then projecting that out and trying to make that happen. And look where that got us historically. Think of all the Christian missionaries that go around trying to fix the world. Think of all the violence that's been done and continues to be done with the idea of fixing a government, fixing a culture, fixing a notion of what's right and wrong. So this pushback is always coming from not looking within, not examining our own suffering. Are there any questions or any sharing? In Plum Village, we also welcome sharing. This notion of just expressing what is happening in your life or what's happening in your understanding at this moment. You're very welcome to do that if you want to.
Susan?
Yeah, Michaela, hi.
Hi, thank you so much. And I don't have something specific to share, but I wonder whether you could expand a bit more about the process of understanding our own suffering. Of course, you mentioned also the fact of being aware about the suffering of our ancestors. That could be a path to also understand our own suffering. And of course, you mentioned the fact of getting back to the present moment. But how can we really be open to our own suffering? What's the... And of course, you mentioned all the other elements of going out of the suffering, but what is really the key of getting through the suffering?
Great, that's a great question. So when we imagine an event, something happens, and we're in pain, whatever is happening has caused us enormous pain. And the first step is to really enter into that pain. So what we tend to do is push it away, or we want to numb it. So you go for the alcohol, or you go for the drugs, or you go for the shopping, or you go for the sex, or you go for a run, whatever your way of dealing is. Everybody does their thing until they wake up to the fact that the pain doesn't go away by doing something. It only goes away. It only starts to minimize when we look right at it. And it's like that image of the crying baby. You know, in the last couple of decades, there's been especially in the 90s, there was a school of child rearing which taught that you should let a baby cry. When the baby was crying, let the baby cry. You let them cry it out, they'll sort themselves, they'll fall asleep eventually. And what is clear from that, aside from the enormous maternal distress that causes, and the pushing against instinct and the pushing against intuition, is that a child who is left to cry, who is not looked after, is an insecure child later on. And they start to have attachment issues, they have psychological issues, they have problems. And that's now we have enough data on that we can see that that's happened. And so they shut down, basically. So instead of having access to their own emotions, then they have been shown that their emotions are wrong or inconvenient or inappropriate or whatever. So they shut down. So as adults, they can't connect either emotionally. And this is what happens to our own suffering. So if we're ignoring our suffering and we're stuffing it down with food, or we're stuffing it down with drugs or alcohol or shopping around, any of those other things to avoid it, it's not going anywhere. We're kicking the can down the road. So now the suffering starts to transform into possibly illness, because it's often at the ground of illness when we have unresolved trauma and emotions. Or it'll start to come up in oblique ways, where it's like a snide remark or sarcasm with your partner, or it'll be like road rage, or there'll be something where it's like this kind of pressure cooker where it's just kind of coming out in fits and starts because we haven't looked at it. So the most urgent thing to do is sit down with ourselves as soon as it's convenient, as soon as it's possible, and really be with the suffering. So being with your suffering does not mean thinking about your suffering. That's being with the story about the suffering. That's the second arrow. Remember the arrows? The first arrow is the event, whatever the pain is. The second arrow is the story that you create around that. And so by being with your suffering and really just sitting with it and feeling, God, this is hard. I'm feeling so much pain. I feel so much absence. You know, like when I lost my baby, there's a visceral component to burying a baby, because particularly, I mean, with any child of any age, but particularly in those days after birth, he was 2.5 days old. And the body has not yet processed the fact that the baby is outside the womb. That often takes up to 3 months. This is why that period of 40 days or 3 months, 4 to 6 weeks at least, is really necessary for a mother to spend with her child. It's a point of, it's adjusting to the fact that now the child is outside the womb. So the body viscerally feels that absence. There's a feeling of a physical change. And of course, the breast milk comes in, but there's no baby to feed. So there's all this stuff going on. And there's no other choice but to surrender to that or suffer immensely. And I've seen a lot of women, even around the time that I lost my baby, I would meet a number of women who could not accept that their child was gone. They couldn't accept their loss. They couldn't accept their own feelings. And what happened is they started to turn so inwards in a psychological way, not in a way that they're aware of themselves, but in a self-obsessive way, that they could no longer be with their children. They could know the children that were already there. They couldn't be with them anymore. They would be there functionally. They'd be making dinner, taking them to school or whatever, but they wouldn't actually be present to their children. And they suffered longer. They suffered possibly, in one case, it was 10 years of real postnatal depression and this whole story around the loss of the baby that became a way of identifying oneself. If you dive right into the pain and you choose in that moment, I'm choosing to live. I choose to live this life. I choose this. This moment is part of my life and I'm still choosing this life. You're no less sad. You're not crying. You're crying, but you're with your crying. And you're allowing that to be fully expressed. And there might be like the ugly crying, the sobbing, and the real pain. But then there are also moments where it's all okay. And in that space of allowing the crying baby in us to do the crying, we cultivate trust. We say, oh, right, this is just one event. It's one thing. It's one thing that is of many, many things that have happened in my life. If you look at Holocaust survivors, you see that very strongly. There are kind of two camps. You have one group of individuals who have remained bitter, remained utterly unable to process what happened, and they stayed very fixated on the abuse and the torment and the trauma that they and their families went through, and their culture. And then there's another group that, leaving the confinement, they said, never again, no way, you will not have me. I'm going to live my life. And that is where people choose. There's a choice point in these critical moments. And we can only make that choice when we're in awareness. We can't choose when we're in the story, because the story then takes on a momentum of its own. And so the first step to dealing with suffering is to acknowledge the pain that we're in. That's the number one thing. The physical response, once you've acknowledged that, is, how am I breathing? So step one, acknowledging, here I am, I'm in a mess, I feel awful. Step two, focus on the breathing. So this is not to bypass, this is not to say, okay, forget that you're feeling awful, now breathe. It's like, okay, I'm feeling awful and I'm breathing, and I allow myself to breathe fully. So what happens when you shut yourself down and you don't breathe is that physically blocks the release of emotions. So if you observe a child who's in the middle of crying, potentially very distressed, and I'm sure we've all seen examples of this, where the parent then yells in their face, stop crying, stop it, enough, go away. And that child is traumatized into stopping crying. So what happens? The only way you can stop crying is to stop breathing. And if you stop breathing, you're literally disconnecting yourself from life itself. It's as good as saying, here I am, I'm dead now. Because what we saw was, if you get another inhale, well, that shows you you're still alive, right? This life continuing. If you shut down and you don't breathe and you hold that emotion, it physically imprints in your body. That we know. Now there's an energetic response on a cellular level that blocks, and that later on becomes disease. That becomes asthma. That becomes, breathing problems. That becomes panic attacks. That becomes all of these things that we think are arising out of the blue later on. And so we breathe. Step one, I'm aware of my suffering. Step two, I'm aware of my in-breath. I allow myself to breathe. I'm aware of my out-breath. And in that moment, we're not trying to fix anything. We're not trying to actually do anything about our suffering. We're welcoming whatever is happening in that moment. So we're not judging it and saying, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I hate feeling this way. This sucks. It's just, this moment is me suffering. This is what it feels like in my body. This is also where we want to develop that practice of awareness of the body. Doing body scans, aware, how do I feel in my shoulders? Am I breathing? Do I have space in my stomach? What's the feeling in my jaw or in my, I don't know, the middle of my shoulder blades? By training your awareness to understand how the body feels, you go there more quickly each time that you're in any context in life. You're more quickly aware, oh, I'm feeling really stressed in my body. I'll just let that go. And the way to go from that feeling or the awareness is through the breath. The breath is the bridge that connects your awareness to your body. So we want to keep that bridge functional. We want to keep it open and functioning. And so your breathing is the most important practice. The breathing practice that Thai describes is actually a practice of the Buddha. It's not a recent invention. This practice is as old as the teaching of the Buddha. This is also a practice that you have in all of the yoga scripture, breathing. What else could be more important than breathing? Literally nothing. And when we stop our breathing, or the breathing is prevented from being natural and in the flow, that's like stopping our participation in life. So look for that connection, look for where that's happening in your experience. What happens, just in the same way as I mentioned earlier about being aware of the body, aware of my heart, aware of my breathing, aware of my shoulders, aware of the air on my skin, something changes. I'm not thinking, oh, I should relax more. It's just, oh, wow, tension. I'm aware of the tension. Well, the body knows what to do. So the situation resolves. It's happening spontaneously. So once you sit with the discomfort of the suffering, you bring your attention to your breath, there's a resolution that's not happening from you being willful. It's not you making that happen. It's happening. And you're in the space of awareness now. There's something shifting. So we know that emotions don't last. The only way that emotions continue is when we preoccupy ourselves with them and we keep feeding the emotion with the story behind it. That's not the emotion lasting, that's the story lasting. That's the mind that's nourishing the same sensation over and over and over again. And it happens so insidiously that we don't even recognize it. We have to stop really to look at that and recognize that the emotion is whatever it is. It's there. And it will, even scientifically, they measured it, it lasts 90 seconds maximum before it changes into something else. So we know that if we just sit in the observation of it and allow it to flow, that feeling of nothing stuck, nothing being held back, the emotion will naturally transform itself. This is the energy of transforming our suffering into understanding, which leads to compassion. At that point, when you've shifted the emotion and you feel, now I'm no longer in the height of the suffering, I'm no longer in that excruciating moment of the pain, I can now come to that choice point. Aha, something's shifting. Now something can be done. I can choose something at this point, because the mind is a little softer now. The mind is a little more clear. It's like a storm. The clouds have passed, and now you can see more clearly. And in that point, we choose to bring in these 4 immeasurables that I mentioned. We choose to bring in this compassion and the loving kindness and this joy. We cultivate that. We cultivate our connection to life itself. We choose that. And the only thing obstructing us is if we allow the mind to obsessively think about some perceived problem or a sense that something shouldn't be the way it actually is. Being in the suffering and choosing to live and being in joy is the definition of a mindfulness practice. That's the way to be in life regarding this particular issue. That's the way to see, I have a choice. I'm not battered about by this emotion unless I allow that to be transformed into obsessive thinking. This is why I made the point about these studies that say that mindfulness is causing more harm than good for some people. It's because they're not practicing mindfulness. They're obsessively thinking. They're thinking and thinking that that's mindfulness. So when Thai says, following the breath, breathing in, aware I'm breathing in, it's not I'm thinking I'm breathing in. It's not like, breathing in, breathing in, breathing in. It's just I'm here in this presence. I'm aware. Just like we are when we're in a calm state and we're just observing things around us, especially easy to practice when it's something that doesn't really concern us. Like you can watch the birds or you can watch, children playing or something and just be in the awareness of it. And not in that obsessive kind of deterministic thinking. I've got to label this, I've got to judge it, I've got to give it a score on 1 to 10, got to take a picture of it to post. So all of that comes from the mind. It's not anything to do with what we're talking about here. It's got to do with resting in awareness, what we're looking at here, resting in our awareness. And cultivating that understanding comes from the right thinking. So we use the mind. It's not like we're trying to avoid the mind. The mind is what it is. It's the nature of the mind to think, just like it's the nature of your stomach to digest or the nature of your heart to beat. That's what it does. The brain is this kind of transmitter receptor picking up thoughts and impulses that are shared throughout the central nervous system. The mind is just there. It's the mind that will tell you, wait a minute, the house is on fire. You should probably leave. There's nothing wrong with the mind. It's how we're relating to the mind that causes the suffering or not. And so when you're cultivating that practice of managing your suffering, the way to manage your suffering is to go right at it, to participate fully, to not to wallow in it. That's again coming to the mind. That's this place of feeling I'm an individuated self, I'm a separate thing, pity me, oh woe is me, so sad to be me, my life is so hard. It can really help to connect yourself to the energy of other suffering for this very reason. That helps to train us out of this idea that we're somehow privileged and different and this shouldn't be happening to us. We don't deserve this. That's again another form of insanity. It's a trick of the mind to say that, because it's not recognizing the true nature of life, which is that it's impermanent and that it's not personal. That's the good news. This idea of emptiness, shunyata, shunya is the zero, the Zen circle that you see, that's shunya. It doesn't mean nothing is there. It doesn't mean there's nothing. It means there's no thing. There's no separate thing. There's no thing called Susan. That doesn't exist. There's a bunch of different elements that come together to arise in a particular form that for a moment in time we label because it's more convenient socially, but it doesn't exist. It's not real. And the problem is, if we don't have that right thinking, if we don't have right view, we attach to that thing that we think exists but doesn't. And then we're upset that it doesn't exist anymore. So recognizing all of that, trying to resolve suffering or trying to live with suffering requires a broad view, requires a really big perspective. And that's where having the three jewels of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha come in. And again, it's not about Buddhism. It has nothing to do with needing to follow that. It's just what I'm presenting here today, because we're honoring Thai. You can find that in many, many different ways. As long as you're finding the teaching on truth, you'll find it, through many, many different schools of thought. And the teacher, the appropriate teacher, you'll find that in dozens or hundreds of people that you might engage with, including even just fleetingly, a person who teaches you something, then you never see them again. And then very important is the Sangha. Surround yourself. Don't try to deal with suffering without some kind of support. And again, choosing the support wisely. I don't want to pick on any particular agency, but as an example of where suffering is, where the idea is to alleviate suffering, but more suffering is created, is in the 12-step programs. In 12-step programs, which started out with Alcoholics Anonymous, there's now many, many, many of them, are predicated on the idea that there's an individuated self, that there's a flaw, that there's a character flaw, that there's something wrong, and that you are condemned. You're forever going to be an alcoholic. And this denies the truth, the number one truth of our awareness of the reality of life, which is that nothing is permanent, that we are empty of form and therefore in a state of impermanence, in a state of flux. So how can it be true that you are an alcoholic if there's no individuated self and nothing is permanent? That makes no sense. And what that does is it perpetuates the belief. And this is why statistically they have a very low rate of real healing. I think it's something like 30%, if that much, of the people who go through the program. The problem is not the people. The problem is that there's a flaw in thinking. The flaw in thinking is that the Sangha needs to be perpetually relied upon because you can't rely on your own judgment. Therefore, you have to stay with this group and you were forever condemned to be an alcoholic or drug addict or whatever. Because there's something wrong with you. And so you can start to see how damaging that can be and how ineffectual that will be as a healing treatment, as a way of relieving the suffering. We now know through studies, but it's been known for thousands of years through all of these wisdom traditions, that all addiction, all addictive behavior, all challenging behavior is coming from suffering. And now the word is used more like trauma. That's more what people are talking about. Trauma is at the root of all addiction. So not everyone who is traumatized becomes an addict, and all addicts have had trauma in their past. So those two things are true. And why is that true? It's because everybody relates to trauma in a different way. The trauma itself is not the problem. Just like we saw earlier when I gave the example of the survivors of the concentration camps, the Nazi concentration camps. Not everybody relates to the same situation in the same way. They make a choice. So our awareness and our understanding of life and what we want that to be for ourselves plays a huge role in the choices that we make. That's right thinking, right? Right thinking is, am I seeing this clearly? Have I understood my situation here? Have I understood the facts of the situation as far as I can see them? And can I see that there might be a different point of view, that there might be a different perspective? So this is the practice. So this is the way to transform your suffering into happiness and into compassion. And it's not an effort, although it will require discipline. That's the right diligence. It will require a committed desire for that outcome that keeps you on that track to keep, working in that direction. But it's not something that requires strain in the sense of effort as strain. It's something that you allow to support your awakening, because in the same way as we can't force ourselves to sleep, we can decide we want to sleep, then we put ourselves in a circumstance that will encourage sleep. So we try and get comfortable, we get horizontal, we put ourselves in a temperature that is supporting our physical well-being. And then we just let sleep happen, right? We can't just kind of lie there and say, sleep, sleep, sleep. And Metta has somehow woken up on that topic. And so we have this need for surrender that we aren't probably used to in our everyday life. We have to trust that we're not the first person to suffer in the world, that we connect to the nature of suffering as a truth, a human truth, and that we recognize, perhaps being inspired by people around us, that there's a way through suffering that can actually lead to happiness, that can actually lead to increased joy and compassion. Not just getting out of the suffering, but actually emerging in a beautiful way. And this is the teaching of no mud, no lotus. If a lotus, the most beautiful flower, extraordinary flower, emerges from mud, it has to have a really gooey, sticky, heavy bottom. If the pond doesn't have that, the lotus won't stick. It can't take root. So this beautiful flower can only take root in the muck. And when you understand that, you start to see it everywhere. It's like, I couldn't have my dinner without manure. I literally couldn't be making my meal. Couldn't get the carrots to the table without the manure that helped to fertilize the fields that grew the carrots. It's all a necessary part of life. You can't abstract anything out of it. You can't have the roses without the compost that the roses needed to flourish in. So the challenge for us then, from the intellectual point of view, is to train the mind away from making that kind of polarization, that kind of judgment that seems to be so reflexive in our current society. It can help, for example, to train yourself away from social media more, train yourself away from connecting to emails, constantly throughout the day, just in ways like that, where you can take over more of the management of your awareness, managing your time, managing your attention. Adjust the settings on your phone. Be radical with that. No notifications, 0 push notifications. Adjust for positive things. Add things in that will bring you benefit. I put in my agenda, I add in things that will be positive. So I have little mantras that pop up at different periods through the day. I have, drink water at certain phases throughout the day. I have something that is going to actually put me on the path towards the, in the direction that I want to go. And I take away the news, the push notifications that come from the social media or that comes from the news or whatever. So yes, puppy. And so wait, so here's Metta. It's Metta. It's making all the noise. And so we are perhaps at the end of our time now, Meta says. She's right on time. She has a knack for doing that. If you have any other questions, I invite you to email me. You should have my email in the notifications you've got from Eventbrite. Thank you so much for being here. It's extraordinary that you are here. If I can just leave you on this note. First of all, it's an extraordinary thing to be born as a human being. Just starting from there, it's a miracle that you actually are here at all. The fact that you survived your parents, whatever they may have gone through that kept them alive, and the fact that you actually emerged through the process of the sperm impregnating the ovum, all of that is a miracle. And when we look at life in that way and we see this is a miracle, then we start to say, wow, okay, so there's something here that's way bigger than me, way bigger than my understanding. It's not about my little life. It's not about my petty little things. The other aspect of you being here is that you're here. So of all the people on the planet, the vast majority of people don't give a second thought to life itself. They just live, they keep going forward, they're struggling on the surface of life, and they never look any deeper than, you know, the scratching of the surface doesn't even occur, perhaps also because they don't have the capacity to do so intellectually or economically or socially. And you are doing that. So you're already putting yourself in a particularly special place. You're already in an unusual, privileged place. And the other aspect is that you're literally here online with me. There are 42 people who signed up for this morning, and there were, I think, 18 who managed to be here. So you're, again, even with people who intend to do the thing that they want to do with their lives, they still don't do it. So recognize that is very important. We can intend all we want. We can decide, yeah, I should do that. That would be nice. One day I'll do that. That would be great. But until we put the right thinking along with the right action, nothing happens. Then you'll get the same kind of muddled results until you decide to put your body where your mind is, to intend and follow through on your intention. And you've all done that. And so I really want you to recognize that, because it's extraordinary. And that alone will help you to cultivate this release of suffering, this understanding that you are, in fact, the decider of your life. Even if you don't get to decide what it all looks like, you get to have that choice point in every moment. Whatever is arising, you choose. What am I going to do with this situation? How will I go forward with this situation? Keeping in mind that it's a miracle that you're here and that everything is impermanent. And so I wish you a wonderful life, and I hope to see you all very soon. And so thanks again for your effort in being here, to all of you.
Thank you, Susan.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Bye. Lovely to see you all.
We're so enriched after, this was huge.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Really,
Thank you,
it was
Susan.
some magic.
Thank you. Lovely to see you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.